Everything you believe about gold as a collapse hedge was formed without this testimony. It changes the analysis completely. Sarajevo, 1993. A man named Selco Begovic is standing in what used to be a middle-class neighborhood. His neighbor, a banker before the war, educated professional, the kind of man who understood money, is holding out a gold necklace. Not asking for food, not asking for medicine. "18 karat. In Sarajevo in 1993, under siege, with no electricity, no running water, and no functioning food distribution system, it was worth less than fire. Fire for boiling water to prevent dysentery. Fire was the difference between eating and not eating, between treating an infected wound and dying from it. Selco Begovic survived over a year inside that siege, who understood that the information might matter to people who had never experienced what he experienced. What he documented does not match what most people believe about gold, about collapse, or about what actually preserves value when institutional systems fail completely. This video examines his testimony, not as survival theory, not as prepper content, but as a forensic case study in how economic value actually behaves when the infrastructure that normally sustains it disappears. The question is what you believe gold actually does, and whether that belief has been tested against documented reality or only against theory. They have examined what happened to gold prices during financial crises, recessions, banking panics, currency devaluations. Those are not the same thing. A financial crisis is a disruption of the system. A systemic collapse is the temporary disappearance of the system entirely. Gold behaves very differently in each environment. Selco's testimony is the clearest documented record of the second environment available in recent history. It deserves to be examined precisely. At its peak, the city of approximately 340,000 people was surrounded by artillery positions in the surrounding hills. Supply lines were severed. The formal economy ceased to function within weeks of the siege beginning. What replaced it was not a primitive version of the economy that had existed before. What replaced it was a fundamentally different system operating on different principles. A system where the value of any object was determined entirely by its immediate practical utility to the person holding it, not by any institutional consensus about its worth. This distinction is the foundation of everything Selco documented. Legal systems enforce contracts denominated in it, remove those institutions, not temporarily, but completely. And gold reverts to what it physically is, a dense, soft yellow metal that does not corrode. Useful for certain industrial applications. Aesthetically valued in cultures with the surplus to care about aesthetics, but nutritionally inert, combustion-resistant, and medically useless. In Sarajevo, under siege, institutional consensus did not exist. There were no central banks setting reserve requirements. There were no insurance systems. There were no enforceable contracts. There was only what a given object could do for a person in the next 24 hours. Under those conditions, Selco documented a precise hierarchy of value that bears no resemblance to the hierarchy that exists in stable economies. At the top, food, not abstract caloric value, specific, storable, calorie-dense food, canned goods, rice, dried beans, cooking oil, coffee, cigarettes, which functioned as currency not because of their recreational value, but because they were standardized, divisible, universally recognized as having fixed utility, and small enough to carry and conceal. Below food, fire, lighters, matches, candles. The ability to produce heat and light without electricity or gas was not a convenience. It was infrastructure. A person who could reliably produce fire could cook, could sterilize water, could provide warmth, could trade fire-starting capability to others who lacked it. Selco documented owning a large propane tank that he used to refill disposable lighters, which he then traded for food, medicine, and other necessities. The lighter was not a primitive tool. It was a liquid asset in the most literal sense, something that could be immediately exchanged for something else of immediate utility. Below fire, medicine. Antibiotics were among the most valuable objects in the siege economy. Penicillin, amoxicillin, basic pain relievers, antiseptic materials. Bandages. People died during the siege, not from bullets alone, but from infections that would have been trivially treatable in a functioning medical system. A course of antibiotics that cost the equivalent of a few dollars outside the siege commanded extraordinary value inside. Because it was the difference between recovery and death, and because it could not be manufactured locally or substituted with anything else, below medicine, tools with direct productive application, a hand tool that could be used to repair shelter, to process food, to maintain basic infrastructure, skills that could be deployed to produce or repair things people needed. And gold? Selco's account is direct. Gold and jewelry held poor value during the crisis itself. Warlords, the men who controlled access to food and medicine and security, understood that gold would regain value once the crisis ended. They were willing to accept it, but at what Selco described as can of soup value. A gold necklace worth months of pre-war salary traded for a can of food or a small quantity of medicine. The person accepting the gold was making a long-term bet that civilization would eventually return, and the institutional consensus sustaining gold's value would be reestablished. The person offering the gold was making an immediate survival calculation. Most people holding gold as a hedge are implicitly modeling a scenario where they are the person accepting it, where they hold gold and exchange it for things they need during a crisis. Selco's testimony documents the opposite. In actual collapse, the person holding gold is the one offering it at devastating discounts to people who hold things of immediate utility. This asymmetry is not accidental. It is structural. Gold's value in a stable economy derives from its role as a store of value, an object that preserves purchasing power across time. That function depends entirely on the existence of a future moment when the stored value can be redeemed. During a siege or a systemic collapse, the future is uncertain in a way that makes long-term value storage largely irrelevant. What matters is not what something will be worth in 6 months, but what it will produce or enable in the next 6 hours. The economic literature on this distinction is substantial. Economists studying historical collapses, the German hyperinflation of 1923, the Soviet collapse of 1991, the Argentine crisis of 2001, the Zimbabwean hyperinflation of 2007-2009, consistently document the same pattern. During the acute phase of collapse, when institutional systems are failing or have failed, the most valuable assets are those with direct productive or consumptive utility. During the recovery phase, when institutional systems begin to reconstitute themselves, stores of value including gold regain their function. The critical insight is that surviving the acute phase is the precondition for benefiting from the recovery phase. Gold protects wealth across the recovery. It does not protect life during the collapse. Selco was explicit about this. He recommended that anyone thinking seriously about preparation consider what the first year of a genuine collapse actually requires, and build from that baseline outward. The baseline is not wealth preservation. The baseline is caloric sufficiency, fire, water purification, basic medicine, and security. Everything else, including precious metals, is secondary to that foundation. Consider what this means for the conventional wisdom about gold as a collapse hedge. The conventional case for gold rests on several claims. First, that it holds value when currencies fail. Second, that it is universally recognized, and therefore universally tradable. Third, that it is portable and concealable. Fourth, that governments cannot inflate it away. All four claims are true, within a specific context. That context is a functioning or recovering economy where institutional consensus about gold's value exists or is being reconstituted. Within that context, gold does what its advocates claim. The historical record of gold's performance during currency crises, the German hyperinflation, the French assignat collapse, the Hungarian pengo hyperinflation of 1946, supports its role as a store of value during monetary system failures. But monetary system failure is not the same as systemic collapse. In monetary system failure, the economy continues to function. People still produce and trade goods and services, but the medium of exchange loses value. Gold substitutes for the failed currency because the institutional infrastructure that assigns value to things continues to operate. Merchants still accept payment. Markets still function. The social trust that makes exchange possible still exists. In systemic collapse, the Sarajevo scenario, the infrastructure of exchange itself breaks down. There are no merchants operating normal businesses. There are no functioning markets. There is no social trust between strangers. Exchange happens in private between people who have established personal trust for objects of immediate utility. In that environment, gold's universal recognizability is not an advantage because there is no universal community to recognize it. This is not an argument against owning gold. It is an argument for understanding precisely what gold does and does not protect against, and ensuring that the baseline requirements for surviving the acute phase of a genuine disruption are addressed before the question of wealth. Preservation becomes relevant Selco's framework, distilled from a year of lived experience inside the most severe urban conflict in post-World War II European history, produces a specific ordering of preparation priorities. The first layer is caloric sufficiency, the ability to produce or store enough food to sustain a household for an extended period without depending on external supply chains. In practical terms, a garden, however small, preserved food with long shelf life, the skills to produce, preserve, and prepare food without modern infrastructure. This layer cannot be replaced by any financial asset. A person holding gold cannot eat it. A person holding a productive garden can eat regardless of what happens to any financial system. The second layer is energy independence at the household level. Not grid-scale energy, household scale. The ability to produce heat, light, and cooking capability without depending on electricity or gas infrastructure. Wood, propane, solar, hand tools that function without power. This layer is what the lighters represented in Sarajevo. Not a sophisticated solution, but a functional one that addressed a non-negotiable need. The third layer is basic medical capability, stored antibiotics, first aid supplies, the knowledge to use them. In a functioning medical system, this layer is largely irrelevant. Professional care is available. In a disrupted system, the ability to treat infections, wounds, and common illnesses without professional assistance is the difference between recovery and potentially fatal deterioration. The fourth layer is tools with direct productive application. The ability to repair shelter, process food, maintain basic infrastructure, skills that exist in a person and cannot be stolen, cannot be inflated away, and remain deployable regardless of what happens to financial systems. The fifth layer, and only the fifth, is wealth preservation across the recovery period. This is where gold and silver belong. Not as survival assets, but as recovery assets, objects that hold value through the period of disruption, and can be exchanged for things of value once institutional systems reconstitute themselves. Selco's account documents what happens when people invert this order, when they hold gold but lack the first four layers. His neighbor, the banker with the gold necklace, had preserved wealth in a form that was useless in the moment he needed to use it. The people who survived most effectively were those who had, deliberately or by circumstance, accumulated the lower layers of the hierarchy. Farmers, people with practical skills, people who had stored food and medicine, people embedded in trust networks with neighbors who could be relied upon. The pattern Selco documented in Sarajevo is not unique to that siege. It is consistent with documented accounts from every major systemic disruption of the 20th century. In the Soviet collapse of 1991, the most immediate problems faced by ordinary citizens were not monetary. They were practical. Food distribution systems failed. Heating systems became unreliable. Medical supply chains broke down. The people who managed best were those with access to productive land, the dacha garden plots, that Soviet citizens had been permitted to maintain, and those embedded in strong local networks that could coordinate resource sharing. In Zimbabwe's hyperinflationary collapse between 2007 and 2009, when the currency lost value so rapidly that the central bank eventually issued a $100 trillion note, the medium of exchange that replaced the Zimbabwean dollar was not gold. It was the US dollar in physical form, an institutional currency backed by a functioning foreign economy, and barter in goods of direct utility. Black market medicines commanded extraordinary prices. Food commanded extraordinary prices. Gold was traded, but at values reflecting its role as a store of wealth for people who could afford to think beyond immediate survival. In Argentina's 2001 crisis, the sovereign default and subsequent peso devaluation documented in this channel is earlier analysis. The population that managed best had maintained dollar savings outside the Argentine banking system and had access to food production through family networks or rural land. The crisis was severe, but not a full systemic collapse. Institutions continued to function at a degraded level, and gold did play a role in wealth preservation for those who held it. But even in that less severe scenario, the people who fared worst were those who had held savings entirely in financial assets, denominated in the domestic currency, and had no practical fallback. The consistent lesson across all of these cases is not that gold is worthless. The lesson is that gold is the wrong first layer of preparation for systemic risk, and that most people who hold gold as a collapse hedge have the hierarchy inverted. What Selco taught us about gold is not a lesson about gold specifically. It is a lesson about the relationship between institutional value and practical value, and about what happens to that relationship when the institutions disappear. Gold holds institutional value. Its price is set by markets, sustained by central bank reserves, supported by jewelry demand, and reinforced by thousands of years of cultural consensus. That institutional value is extraordinarily durable across time and across monetary crises, but it is not durable across the temporary disappearance of institutions themselves. The lighter in Sarajevo held practical value. It addressed a non-negotiable human need, fire, with a small, portable, concealable, replaceable tool that required no institutional infrastructure to be useful. Its value did not depend on any market, any bank, any government, or any cultural consensus. It depended only on the universal human requirement for heat and light. In a functioning economy, institutional value and practical value are so deeply intertwined that most people never need to distinguish between them. Gold is valuable because everyone agrees it is valuable, and that agreement is reliable enough to treat as a fact rather than a convention. In a disrupted economy, the distinction becomes the most important analytical question available. What holds value because of institutional consensus? What holds value because of direct practical utility? And in a scenario where institutions fail, which do you actually hold? Selco Begovic's banker neighbor understood money. He had spent his career inside the institutional system that assigned value to things. He understood interest rates and exchange rates and credit markets. What he did not understand, until he was standing in a ruined neighborhood offering gold for lighters, was that all of those systems were downstream of something more fundamental. Downstream of fire, downstream of food, downstream of the practical capacity to sustain human life without infrastructure. That is what Sarajevo taught about gold. Not that it is worthless, that it is fifth in the hierarchy, and that most people who hold it as their primary hedge have skipped the first 4 layers entirely. The hierarchy is not a theory. It is a documented pattern across multiple collapses, across multiple countries, across multiple decades. The people who built from the foundation upward survived. The people who held wealth in institutional forms and neglected the foundation did not always survive. And when they did, they paid for their survival at can-of-soup prices. The Global Peace Index, the IMF fiscal monitors, the central bank reserve reports, the data this channel examines consistently, all point toward a world where the distance between financial stability and financial disruption is narrower than it has been in decades. Whether that narrowing produces a crisis, and when and of what severity, is not something this channel claims to predict. What this channel does claim is that the hierarchy Selco documented is worth understanding now, while the institutional systems are still functioning, while the preparation options are still available, while the decision of where to position across that hierarchy can be made with time and resources, rather than desperation. The banker with the gold necklace did not make a wrong decision when he bought the gold. He made a wrong decision when he stopped there. If this forensic examination of documented collapse is useful, if understanding what actually preserves value across genuine systemic disruption, rather than what financial theory suggests should preserve value, is the analysis you want to develop, subscribe to this channel. That is what this channel exists to produce. Leave a comment with this question. Knowing what Selco documented, knowing that gold traded at can-of-soup value during the acute phase of the Sarajevo siege, does it change anything about how you're currently thinking about what you hold and why? I read every comment. The answers shape what this channel examines next. The hierarchy exists. The documentation is public. The pattern is consistent. The only question is which layer you are currently on. There is one more dimension of Selco's testimony that most analyses overlook entirely: the social architecture of collapse economics. In Sarajevo, exchange did not happen in open markets. It happened in private, between people who already knew each other, in arrangements built on pre-existing trust. Selco documented this explicitly. The best trades were made with people you knew before the crisis. Trust was not a soft social asset. It was economic infrastructure. Without it, exchange was dangerous. A stranger offering gold might be desperate enough to take it back by force. A neighbor whose character you had observed across years of ordinary life was a counterparty you could actually do business with. This dynamic reshapes the entire preparation calculus. A person who holds food, medicine, and fire-starting capability, but is embedded in no trust network, faces a security problem. They hold assets that others need and lack the social architecture to exchange safely. A person with fewer physical assets but deep community roots has access to a network that can coordinate resource sharing, provide security, and sustain collective survival in ways that isolated households cannot replicate. The meta-analytic research on social relationships and survival outcomes supports this with striking precision. Studies examining survival across disaster scenarios, not theoretical models but documented outcomes from actual events, consistently find that social embeddedness is among the strongest predictors of individual survival. Communities that had established coordination mechanisms before a crisis activated those mechanisms during it. Communities that had not improvised, and improvisation under acute stress produces worse outcomes than preparation. The Amish communities that this channel has examined in other contexts represent the extreme case of this principle. Their survival architecture is not primarily physical, it is social. Dense networks of mutual obligation, established over generations, that activate automatically when individual members face hardship. No individual Amish household is self-sufficient in isolation. The community is collectively self-sufficient, and that collective capacity is more robust than any individual household's physical preparation could be. For someone thinking carefully about what Selco's testimony implies for their own positioning, this dimension cannot be ignored. The physical layers of the hierarchy, food, fire, medicine, tools, can be accumulated individually. The social layer cannot. It can only be built through sustained investment in relationships and community participation before it is needed. By the time it is needed, it is too late to build. This is the final lesson Sarajevo offers. Not just what to hold, but who to hold it with. The banker held gold alone. The people who survived most effectively held relationships. And through those relationships, access to the distributed resources of a community that had learned to function without the institutional infrastructure that had always sustained them before. That is the complete hierarchy. And it begins not with what you buy, but with where you are and who you know.